Good morning and welcome to Lab for Energy. My name is Matthew Zaragoza Watkins. I'm a researcher at MIT, and today I'll be discussing energy, growth, and development. Today we'll be asking the questions, how does our society use energy? We'll be exploring energy, innovation, and its connection to growth. We'll be understanding why energy poverty is connected to development. And finally, we'll take a look at energy and in the environment, thinking about our future. I want to start off with a simple exercise, and I would love for all of you to think about this yourselves. How have I used energy today? Well, this morning, my alarm clock went off. I got up and turned on the lights. I jumped in the shower. I made myself coffee. I ate cereal and milk, and then I drove here to work. In all of those things, there's a tremendous amount of energy embodied, from the electricity used to power the alarm clock and the lights, to the natural gas burned in heating the water for my shower, the natural gas burned in heating the water for my coffee, and the refrigeration, the electricity used to keep my milk cold, and finally, the petroleum refined product used to fuel my car driving here to work. You can imagine that this is the same thing that many people do across all of Europe, much of Asia, and the United States. And maybe the experience would be different in less developed countries around the world, where many of these activities aren't possible because of a lack of electrification or access to resources. Certainly, looking historically, prior to the Industrial Revolution, many of these same activities might have taken someone like me hours out of the day just to heat water, to walk to work, or perhaps to tend a farm. It's amazing the things that we can do today just utilizing specialization and electricity. Now let's think about how our society uses energy broadly, not just you as an individual, but all of the actions that go into us working together. Society uses energy for transportation. We use energy for food production. We use energy to produce other goods and services that we sell around the world. We use it to treat our water. We use it to light our homes, to heat and cool in the winter and summer. And in developed countries, we use energy for entertainment. These are all resources, services, and abilities that we have access to as developed countries, which wouldn't be possible without a tremendous amount of energy at our disposal and the ability to transport that energy long distances via electrification. Most notably, modern cities use a tremendous amount of energy. Here I have a grid of New York City, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, and on the left, sorry.
Don't worry.
So is it going to be their left? How are they? I guess they're going to view this as right, the way that I'm viewing it. Yeah, I mean
not
it's...
in your position, but in my position.
Oh, they're
So-
going to view it as your position.
Yes, no?
Yes.
Cioè loro lo vedono come se io, è come se io fossi qui a destra e lo schermo...
Lo vedono esattamente come lui.
So it's not mirrored,
Okay.
it's...
No,
It's
no.
not, it's
No,
not
no.
me.
They see
It's
the
the
screen
same
as
view.
you see it.
Okay.
So if you say right, it's the right of people who is watching, who
Perfect.
are watching
If you
the
want,
screen. Yes.
you
It makes sense to me now. I just had this one question.
okay.
And of course, most of us live in cities, and modern cities use a tremendous amount of energy to allow us to do all of the things that we do on a regular basis. Here on the right, I have a distribution of energy density, which is the amount of energy that's used per square meter, and population density, the compactness of communities. And as you see, as population density increases in modern cities, as exemplified in the United States, the amount of energy required to fuel those cities increases at a similar rate. taking this to the example of New York City, on the left, we have the energy concentration, the energy usage concentration of a typical block within New York City. You can see that around Central Park and in the areas of Manhattan where the most economic activity occurs, primarily lighting and heating and transportation, the energy density required is tremendous. Whereas in the outer areas, where it's more residential and small commercial, energy is less required, but still significant. To put this into perspective, on a global scale, the energy density required to power a typical block in Brooklyn, one of the lightest colored blocks and the lowest energy density overall, is equivalent to the same amount of energy required to...
Don't worry. You're all the time you want.
Thank you. To put this into perspective, the same amount of energy required to heat and electrify a city block in central Manhattan is equivalent to the amount of energy required to fuel, heat, and electrify a small village in rural India. Naturally, one asks, where does this energy come from? In OECD countries, predominantly we use crude oil and refined product, coal, natural gas, nuclear energy, hydro, and to some degree we use biomass and biofuels. You can see that globally the trend is in extra utilization of coal, natural gas, and petroleum products over the last 40 years. Why do we use so many fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are the most energy-dense source available, far more dense than wind, solar, biomass, or geothermal. The density inherent in fossil fuels is often 2 to 3 orders of magnitude larger than what might be available from traditional biomass combustion. Putting this into perspective, here we have a graph of energy consumption per person in kilowatt hours and population density per person in square kilometers. As you can see, in olive green, North America has a high concentration of energy usage per capita, but relatively low population density, whereas much of South and East Asia, highlighted in red, has a significant amount of population density, but relatively low per capita energy consumption. You can imagine as time progresses and Southeast Asia develops more significantly, that pattern is going to change. On the green lines, we have the amount of energy embodied in traditional crops all the way up to more intensive fossil combustion. The way to think of these lines is how much energy would be required in order to supply a typical population across a specific area. As you can see, the lowest line, energy crops, provide about half a unit of work per meter squared. If the entire population of the United States were to be covered, the lowest line, energy crops, provide approximately half of 1 unit of work per meter squared. If the entire area of the United States were to be covered by energy crops, and those energy crops were used to fuel energy and transportation, lighting and heating needs in the United States, we would barely be able to meet our energy needs. Similarly, China, were it covered entirely in energy producing crops, would only barely be able to meet its energy needs. By comparison, as you move out along the green lines, first going to wind power, then solar, then fully concentrated solar, and finally on the farthest outreaches, fossil power and nuclear energy, you see that the amount of energy produced, and accordingly the amount of area required to supply the energy needs of even the largest and most developed countries, is easily met. And how does this all work? It's electrification. taking this rich and dense energy source and transforming it into easily transportable power that can supply our homes and businesses, fueling our economic activity. The graphic below describes the process by which power generation stations, common in most of the developed world and in the developing world, transfer this energy-dense resource first into electricity, then distributing that electricity throughout an electric grid, supplying commercial and industrial businesses and homes. Next, I'd like to talk about energy, innovation, and growth. The famed historian Václav Smil once said, "There is only one kind of primary energy that was not known to the first high civilizations of the Mid-East and East Asia, and by all of their pre-industrial successors. Isotopes and heavy elements whose nuclear fission has been used since the late 1950s to generate heat that in turn produces steam for modern electric turbo generators. Every other energy source has been known for millennia, and most of them were harnessed by pre-modern societies." What Smil is saying is that apart from nuclear energy, modern and prehistoric societies have known about fossil generation and obviously about biomass for many, many thousands of years. And yet only recently have we been able to truly harness these resources to grow and build the sorts of civilizations that you see today. Why? As you can see from this graph, which shows, again, energy usage by source across time, biomass has been a relatively constant resource utilized, whereas resources like crude oil and natural gas have more only recently have they been used to the same degree. And as you can see, in 1950 and for natural gas in 1970, only then did they surpass biomass as a primary resource for fueling our society. What is it that changed about our society and the way that we utilized energy that led us to transfer from using biomass to using fossil resources? The fundamental difference between traditional and modern uses of energy consists not in access to new or better resources, as described by Smil previously. Those resources were always known to exist. Rather, it's in the innovation and mass deployment of efficient, affordable, reliable, and convenient prime movers, or machines, devices that convert primary energies such as fossil and biomass into mechanical power, electricity, and heat. As you can see from this graph, we now plot significant innovative activities that have occurred over the last 200 years. Beginning with James Watt's invention of the steam engine in 1780, coal became increasingly more utilized to power machines to make our everyday lives easier and to promote production. In 1803, the first steamship was introduced, allowing goods to be transported across the ocean against prevailing winds. In 1872, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. In 1882, the first coal generation facility became available. In 1890, the automobile engine was produced, allowing for the combustion of refined petroleum products into the... Sorry. Let me start over there. The last 200 years has been an era of dramatic energy innovation. Beginning with James Watt's invention of the steam engine in 1880, the last 250 years has been an era of tremendous energy innovation. Beginning with James Watt's invention of the steam engine in 1780, which first allowed for the combustion of coal to produce mechanical energy, which drove production of textiles and steam engines, Later, in 1872, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, allowing for electrification at night and extended hours of work. In 1880, the first coal-generating electric station was introduced, allowing for mass electrification of an electric grid. In 1890, the auto engine was introduced, allowing for mass transit and the distribution of goods across extended networks. In 1892, Thomas Edison opened his Pearl Street generating station in New York City, providing the first broad electric grid available in the developed world. In 1930, as we see crude oil use expand, as well as natural gas first arrive, the gas turbine was invented, broadly expanding the availability of generation resources across the developed world. After World War II, the United States Rural Electrification Act expanded electric resources and the development of electric generation sources across all of the United States. As you can see, following these events, there is initially slow uptake in the use of these resources, and then vast, rapid increases as the technology is deployed and adopted across the world. And finally, a slowing in the extent of development as the deployment is completed and the resources are widely used and available. Finally, in 1970, you see the introduction of solar cells and wind turbines in the modern era. This was a more quick adoption of the technology and is essentially mature at this point. What does this mean for modern society? On the left, you see a picture of Nebraska circa 1830. This is Middle America. To the right, you see a picture of Omaha, Nebraska circa 1930. As you can see, the rapid deployment of energy and technology has allowed for mass development. As seen in the last two images, energy fuels economic growth. On the graph below, we see quadrillions of BTUs, those are units of energy, consumed by the United States across time, and the relationship that it has to gross domestic product, the amount of economic activity seen in the United States over the same era. As you can see, beginning in 1945, after mass electrification and the advent of new technologies such as the gas turbine, the relationship between energy use and economic growth is strong. Ultimately, energy use fuels economic growth, allowing the United States to more than quadruple its GDP over the span of 50 years. Energy use also fuels population growth. As economic prosperity allows more people to survive and better quality of life to increase, you see increases in the amount of population as a rate of growth. Next, I'd like to explore energy, poverty, and development. Just like economic prosperity, energy use is uneven around the world. Seen on this graph in gigajoules per capita of energy consumption, the United States ranks first, using nearly twice as much energy as European countries. Below that is the world average, and below that is the average energy utilization of China. As you can see, China's average energy utilization over the last 50 years has grown from roughly 5% of US per capita energy consumption to nearly 20% of US per capita energy consumption. While China still has much room to grow before it surpasses the United States, because of China's massive population, China's total energy usage has grown dramatically. Next, we'll discuss energy, poverty, and development. Just like economic prosperity, as described in the last section, energy use is uneven around the world. Here we have a graph of gigajoules per capita of energy use across time for several different regions of our world. As you can see from the graph, energy use per capita has been relatively stable in the United States over the last 50 years and represents the highest energy use in the world. Energy in FSU and European countries is relatively lower, accounting for the efficiency of European energy use and the density of Europe. Below that, we have the world average energy utilization. Just to put a comparison on it, Americans use approximately 6 times the world energy average. What accounts for this? It must be that other societies in developing countries and underdeveloped countries don't have the same access to energy that Americans do. As you can see in the final figure, China, in purple, has gone from average per capita energy of approximately 5% of the United States in 1965, tripling to approximately 15% of the energy use of the United States by 2010. This raises important questions. Obviously, China's energy utilization per capita is far below the United States still. Yet, when reflecting on total energy consumption of China relative to the United States, China is now the first largest energy consumer in the world. What does that mean as China's per capita energy utilization grows to surpass Europe and to approach the United States? Is that sustainable? And what sort of fuel supply will be able to fuel their development? Returning to our graph of power density, energy usage, and population, we see that China is not alone in its low per capita energy consumption. India, Bangladesh, much of sub-Saharan Africa in blue, and Northern Africa in dark green also have very low per capita energy consumption and relatively high populations. Summing across this graph, you can see that approximately half of the world's population has per capita energy consumption below 100 kilowatt hours per day per person. As you imagine China's population growing, along with India, sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, and their per capita energy consumption increasing, the need to supply more energy-dense fuel in order to fuel the development of these countries becomes evident. What does modern access to fuel look like today? In 2008, a survey of developing countries shows that in much of China and all of Central Africa, access to modern fuels is below 50%. In South America and Northern Africa and the Middle East, that's cut to only 25%. But what that means is 1 in 2 in the case of China and Central Africa, and 1 in 4 in the case of South and Central America, as well as North Africa, don't have access to transportation fuels and diesel power that is often used to heat and cool homes and to supply electricity, to treat water, and in the production of goods and services necessary for our modern way of life. Looking at electrification, you see a similar pattern across the world. While electricity is provided somewhat more readily in Asia and South America, the availability of electricity in Central Africa remains very, very low. Looking across the world and ordering countries by their availability and access to electricity, we see a strong relationship between electrification and development. On this graph, we have the population percentage who does not have electricity, and the population in millions across the bottom axis. And on the top, we have dollars per capita of GDP traced out in the red line. As you can see, as the access to electricity increases in population terms, per capita GDP also increases, where countries with large population and high per capita GDP rarely, if ever, have significant populations without access to electricity. What does this mean? Does this mean that electricity drives growth and innovation? Does it mean that developed countries are just richer and therefore are able to provide electricity to their entire populations? How do you unravel the puzzle of electrification, energy availability, and growth? Now we explore the relationship between energy development and human development. Below, you'll see a figure with human development index on the vertical axis and the energy development index on the horizontal axis. The dots plot the levels of human development for specific countries around the world and their associated level of energy development. The red line plots the relationship between energy development and human development. The R2 equal to 0.78 implies a robust relationship between energy development and human development. Unpacking this, let's think about what that means for the developing world. As energy resources are developed and harnessed to provide electricity and power to society, society is able to focus instead of on the day-to-day activities of providing basic food, shelter, clean water, and access to agriculture. Society is able to make investments in infrastructure projects such as clean water treatment facilities, roads, schools, and other public facilities that provide for the general welfare of society and allow people to focus on more privately productive activities that drive their own private wealth and economic prosperity. How important is energy access to human development and security? The figure below plots millions of deaths per year from common causes of premature death in developing countries. As you can see from the figure, deaths resulting from malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS are expected to fall dramatically over this 22-year period, whereas deaths from smoke from the combustion of biomass are expected to increase over the same time horizon. What does that mean for somebody living in a developing world? It means that the cook stoves that they use today and are projected to use over the next 20 years are killing them. Indoor smoke, inhalation, and inefficient cooking combustion drive indoor air particulates up, causing difficulty in respiration, asthma, stroke, emphysema, and ultimately premature death. This is avoidable if energy access is expanded to developing world more rapidly, and these countries are able to harness modern technologies and the combustion of energy-dense fossil fuels such as natural gas, which has very low particulate matter combustion for the amount of energy released. Many of these deaths over the next 2 decades will be able to be avoided. Now let's discuss energy and the environment. Here we have a graph, which is common knowledge to us now, that shows energy use by fuel type across time. As we discussed previously, much of this expansion of energy use is the result of changes in technology, innovations that have allowed us to harness some of the most energy-dense resources available, and those same energy sources and technological innovations have allowed us to grow dramatically. As we look to try and include other developing countries in the same level of economic prosperity that North America and Europe and some of Asia have been able to achieve, we consider the economic costs of providing growth and development in a world with finite resources. This figure shows energy use per capita and CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, per capita over the same time. As you can see, the blue line of energy use and the red line of greenhouse gas emissions track each other very closely over the period. What does this mean? It means that as we combust more fossil fuels, the energy-dense resources that allow us to grow, expand, and develop to provide greater resources to society, we also bear some economic cost. Not only the cost of extracting and combusting those resources, and the capital investments in generation resources necessary to turn those resources into electricity and energy, but also a climate cost. The greenhouse gas emissions associated with combusting that energy. As you can see, the two lines have diverged over that time frame. That divergence, the separation between the blue line and the red line, represents increased utilization of lower greenhouse gas emitting resources. Resources such as petroleum as compared to coal, natural gas as compared to petroleum, and recently, renewable resources such as wind, solar, and geothermal have allowed us to lower the greenhouse gas intensity of the energy that we use to fuel our economic prosperity. As we look forward, and as we imagine our world developing and expanding the use of our resources, we consider what the economic and climate costs may be. Looking at the development of Europe and North America in blue relative to Southeast Asia in red and the Middle East and North Africa in green, it's apparent that the primary driver of growth in greenhouse gas emissions, a potential driver of climate change, is development of energy use and fuel combustion in Southeast Asia. Why? How is it that over a period of rapid economic growth in Europe and North America, we've been able to relatively stabilize our use of energy and our production of greenhouse gas emissions, while in countries in North Africa, the Middle East, and primarily in Southeast Asia, a level of development and economic growth has been associated with large increases in greenhouse gas emission production. In part, this has to do with the efficiency with which the developed world has been able to utilize fossil resources over that time. As our economy has grown, the efficiency of utilization of those resources has also grown, allowing us to have a relatively stable per capita energy consumption over that time frame. Providing development and balancing the need to curb greenhouse gas emissions over the future will require us to transfer similar technologies, modern and state-of-the-art, to developing countries so that they are able to leapfrog the early stages of industrialization, fueled by less efficient use of fossil resources with more efficient combustion, which can unleash tremendous energy at relatively low climate costs. Today we've discussed how our society relies on sustainable energy. Sustainable energy in the form of energy-dense fossil resources have allowed our society globally to rapidly advance over the last 2 centuries. Technology innovation, specifically the introduction of auto engines, gas-generating turbines, and electrification, have allowed us to harness energy ever more efficiently, fueling a dramatic global economic boom. Unfortunately, not all members of society have been able to access energy and technology to the degree that Europeans and North Americans have been able to. The inability to access energy, harness technology has hindered human development in much of Southeast Asia and Africa, as well as parts of South America. Future development goals must emphasize the need to provide greater energy access to developing countries so that they might be able to more efficiently utilize fossil resources and expand economic growth, driving infrastructure improvements and improvements in quality of life accordingly. Finally, the environmental challenge of growing demand for energy must be considered when driving our development, both in human context and in economic context, goals. Thank you so much for joining Lab for Energy. Have a wonderful day.